go
Oh,
like
yes.
Yep.
Yes, we are streaming
You're
now.
streaming? Okay, good. So Barbara, you're the chair, so.
Okay, what I was saying is that we looking at for these bylaw changes, as a result of a conversation that basically Vanessa and Tony had, where they felt that committee assignments weren't done, properly, or I should say more democratically, and also the appointment of the new trustee when we had a vacancy. And so what I try to do is take a look at the bylaws and just share some ideas of how we could basically revert back to the way these matters have been dealt with in the past, but they had never been codified. And so that's simply my attempt at striking a more democratic tone to our bylaws. So do you want to start with Article 3, Section 3C, Board of Trustees, and share your thoughts?
Ooh.
Michael, it looks like you have some input, but we're not
No,
hearing.
I think I'm fine with this. I don't know. I guess the only question is like the last sentence of that. And I don't. It's probably totally fine. It's saying that there'll be an opportunity at a special meeting of the board to to interview candidates. And I just wondered if in certain circumstances, if there's time constraints or time crunch and we're trying to really do things quickly, would that create a constraint of having to have an extra meeting to get things, but probably not. And I suppose you could always, I think in practice is probably perfectly fine. So I think I'm fine with that.
Okay, Phil?
I mean, to the point that Mike was making, I think what this does is it turns the process into a much longer process and involves everybody on the board for it. And I think one of the challenges we've been facing is that people are not understanding the purpose of committees and where that separation is supposed to come in. The complaint about having less people on the board or having less committees on the board or whatever it is of this is going to be too much work kind of leads into this conversation, because if people have a problem with 1 or 2 hours a month at most, it seems, to be involved in committees, I think the idea of let's all review a whole bunch of resumes and then have another meeting to discuss the resumes and then interview all the candidates and stuff above and beyond the normal board meetings, I think people are going to find that to be really cumbersome in practice. I get that people have been confused about the process, and I'm sorry that that's the case, but if we can't let a committee do a committee's job without having to then spend an hour or so as a full board to go over everything that was done in the committee, there's no point in committees. We might as well abolish them all and do everything in 10-hour-long board meetings. I just don't think that's feasible.
So I don't disagree with what Phil just said, and I think my contention wasn't around committee activity and then sort of relitigating everything or redoing all the work in a full board meeting. I am interested in the discussion of what aspects of filling a vacancy, what parts of that process are appropriate to delegate to a committee, and what participation is appropriate for the full board. I don't think it is feasible nor efficient to have the full board be involved in narrowing a full like all of the submissions as for consideration. I think at a minimum the full board should have access to them. I would have preferred to see and have seen in other boards, a narrowed pool, but some sort of opportunity to hear from the candidates. I mean, I was approached at a public restaurant by someone who had submitted their resume and no one ever talked to her. And, she felt like, her gesture and her interest wasn't really taken seriously and didn't have the opportunity to express herself. And in fairness, I'm not sure what kind of selection process we're doing or due diligence we're doing, even if it was the whole board, by picking replacements based off of mere resume review. So, my objections were multifaceted, and I would not actually endorse a process where we all did every part of it. But the whole point of a committee is, what aspects of the work can we delegate to a small group? And then what is the role of the full board in response to that? To me, voting up and down a predetermined slate with no other sort of input into that didn't feel adequate or appropriate.
So if I can speak to that, I understand that. And I want to point to a convergence of very strange things happening all at the same time. At the point where we had these vacancies, it was our entire leadership team. We had nobody running the board. We had nobody who was typically the kind of person who would gather all that information and make sure everybody got it. Everybody had access to the resumes, et cetera. Also with COVID and with things not being in person, and with us barely having enough people, if I understand it correctly, if one more person left the board, the entire board would have been dissolved, period, end of story. So we were at a point where we could barely get a quorum. We could barely get a bylaw change because we had exactly as many people to make a bylaws change. And we had no leadership to run this. So I don't suspect that we're going to be in a situation where we need to find 3 or 4 board members as soon as possible to keep the board functioning like we did, and in a situation where there was no leadership to manage that process. So I think this was really the exception, and I don't like the idea of going back and changing primary documents like this to deal with a once in a lifetime kind of exception. I think in most cases, and Barbara can probably speak to this, reaching out to one of the other candidates and having them accept the position is probably all that usually happens when somebody leaves the board. In the case that there are more vacancies or somebody's not interested, we're probably going to get a handful of resumes for one position. We're not going to be looking at replacing, multiple board members in a short period of time at a point where we don't have, where we barely have a quorum. So I think the idea of, and, to your point about paring things down, whether we pared 10 resumes down to 2 or 3 or whatever it was, if we're paring it down, that necessarily means that the entire board has to now look at those resumes, have a discussion about those resumes, and make a decision about those resumes and interview people. So whether we're doing that for 3 people or 5 people or 7 people, well, it doesn't change that it now requires, by the bylaw, a separate meeting for us all to review and go through this process. And it kind of negates the purpose of the nominating committee in that example. We just happen to have a very exceptional time and did what we could to get through it. And one last thing before we go, is it 3 times I've now served on here, Tim? In all 3 times, it was somebody approached me and asked me to do it. I said yes. There's never been a resume process, and the only type of review has just been, I came to the board meeting, people asked me whatever question they wanted to ask me, and I answered, and they said, welcome to the board. And that was really all it is. And the questions were, how are you doing? Why do you like libraries? Why do you want to be here? Maybe at best we could go back to the board meetings from the first time and see what that was. But it was really just, we're looking for somebody interested to help serve on the board for a short period of time because we need to remain functional so the library can remain functional. That's all I got.
I mean, I'm not sure the best way to resolve that. I mean, I fundamentally disagree with many of the points that you just stated. I think it is foreseeable that we can find ourselves in some really odd situations coming up, given the fact that currently we have 4 vacancies and 1 person applied. And, I do think that not all committees are created equal. There are some responsibilities of the nominating committee that are internal, that I can get behind. I totally see and understand the policy or the mechanism that identifies a runner-up candidate who had gone through the steps of getting signatures and making a public statement, having some sort of visibility. They weren't maybe selected in the general election, but following up with them makes sense to me. Having a subset of the board choose from a batch of resumes and then just putting those people on doesn't seem to fit the pattern of the other ways that we select board members. And I guess at a minimum, I would love there to be a part of the process that requires the board members, you know, to speak to the people that they're planning to put forward and at least get their feedback on some sort of position or perspective so we know what we're getting into. I don't see it as just like identifying a willing, warm body to, you know, fill a spot until the next election. I actually think it's more important than that. And, you know, so I would just like to have some sort of the reason we got to this point, at least from my perspective of needing a policy change, is that things were said about the practice and how things went so that I, you know, I'm like, okay, I'll take your word for it. And then it didn't go like that. So short of people doing what they say they're going to do, then I do think we need to have something a little bit more explicit. It might not be everything that I want to see, but I do think that it's worth considering that there's some space for improvement.
So Vanessa, if I can jump in for just 1 second, Barbara, I'm sorry. The idea of this not going the way that we said, another board member went so far as to essentially accuse the nominating committee of lying and of having some secret agenda. And I went through the board meeting where we discussed this. I even sent out details of what happened in there and timestamps for when in the meeting the process was discussed and how we followed it to the letter. If you'd like me to forward that email off to you, I'd be happy to do it. But what we did was exactly what the bylaws at the time said to do, and what we discussed in that board meeting and everyone agreed upon.
And interestingly enough,
coming
I
back
did the same
afterwards
thing.
and
What
making
was
accusations
done
is
was
terrible.
similar to what was in the bylaws, but I have timestamps of when people told me practices of talking to the candidates and interviewing them, and that didn't happen. And so I can share my email with you too. I mean, I just, whether or not, you know, just moving and looking forward, how can we improve on this process? How do other boards handle this that are maybe, it might be instructive or more effective or reduce either real or perceived things. I didn't accuse anybody of doing anything maliciously. I know you didn't say me, but I want to clarify that because we're live and streaming. That's not me or my position. I just was disappointed because I felt like I had been led to believe something different or having a different role in it than I was actually ultimately able to have.
Okay, Vanessa, let me just jump in and share why I put in the language that I did to allow for that board participation. Phil says that, you know, it's onerous and time consuming. It is, but it's an important thing that it is the duty of the full board. What we have done in the past is had the special meeting in 2 ways, one of which was like an hour before our regular meeting, an opportunity for the candidates to come in, talk with the people. All of us have had their letters of intent or their resumes, you know, before the meeting, an opportunity to ask questions of the candidates. And you get a feel for why they want to serve, and, you know, and then it's the full board's decision. I really believe that selecting the trustee by using this process, it's full transparency. Everybody sees everything. We have never, in all my years of service, had huge numbers of people wanting to fill these positions. And I know you said, are there similar organizations on the school board when we've had vacancies? This is the process that we follow. We get letters of interest, resumes, any supporting documentation that the individual might want. Then we have a general meeting where all the candidates come before the board. They introduce themselves. We ask questions of them, and then the board goes and votes, you know, on the candidate and makes a selection. To me, that's the most transparent way, the way that the entire board participates in the process. And if you want to change this language in some way, to restrict the number of people. As I said, we've never ever had that many people that it would take forever for people to read, these people's documents. As I said, to me, this is the most transparent way. It's the most democratic way. The entire board gets to participate. It doesn't have to be a long, huge meeting. I think for the most part, we give each candidate like 5 minutes to introduce themselves. Then the board has time to ask questions. Over the years, rarely are there tons and tons of questions. We're just glad to have people that are willing to serve. But with this little tiny revision of, having it in our bylaws that the full board participates in the selection of the candidates, having had an opportunity to review their letters and meet them. And why I said have the opportunity to interview. On occasion, we've had 1 or 2 board members who couldn't make that particular meeting for whatever reason, prior commitments, illness or whatever. But the opportunity was there if they wanted to meet the candidates and, and basically have a say in the selection. So the process worked, in years past. It works well for the school board. I don't know about any other, what they do for the town board or any of the other things, but it seems the more transparent you can be, the more collegial you can be, the more collaborative you can be. It just makes for better dynamics on the board. Go ahead, Phil.
I don't disagree with that, but we were dealing with the lack of leadership at the time, which led to all the resumes not being disseminated to everybody. And we were dealing with COVID restrictions at the time, which meant we were doing things virtually and we were reviewing these resumes. And again, we were dealing with barely having a functional board where one more member would have forced our board to dissolve at the time. So we were under time constraints to fill these positions as soon as possible and decided to forego the interviews. Outside of that, everything else about the process was as transparent as it could be. Besides it being discussed in that meeting, everybody could have attended that, whether it's a special board meeting to look over the resumes or a nominating committee meeting that everybody was aware of. Everyone could have attended that. And Barbara did, and Barbara had input. And even though she couldn't vote because she wasn't a member of the committee, it doesn't change that she could have been involved in the process, had an opinion, and then when the board got presented those candidates from the nominating committee, she could have spoken out and said what she wanted to about them, and she could have voted no. And anybody else there could have done the same. So the opportunity was there. Nobody took advantage of it. And codifying it into here to make it where we have to do this, I don't think is going to change that people did not want to be involved. They just wanted to complain after the fact.
I think that's unfair. I mean, I think we lean on the whole, you have the opportunity to participate in committee meetings thing, but you didn't a little too much. Obviously, when meetings are scheduled at the committee level, they're scheduled with the actual members' availability in mind and not others. So me particularly, I wasn't available to attend, but I had at that time, I had the understanding, which was an incorrect one, that there was going to be an opportunity to talk or discuss the candidates. And so then I was like, that's how I resolved it. And so, it's the reality. And I would rather see us think and look going forward. I'm not sure we'll be productive if we continue to debate what happened or what was intended, et cetera, in this past instance. It was incredibly just extreme circumstances. I think we can all agree. But looking forward, I wouldn't want to base our policy and our practice on such a rare extreme circumstance. If there's usually more time, and if typically, what can we do to ensure that the typical practices happen? And I can appreciate that this past time, a full board meeting interview didn't happen, but the nominating committee didn't even talk to the candidates. And that was where I was particularly stuck, and where I want to ensure that we can be assured of a minimum level of process. And the nominating committee had their reasons, or felt the same time pressures. Again, I don't mean this to be like an indictment of them as individuals, but just how can we make sure that we have sort of a shared understanding of a minimum practice going forward. I don't know what the language should say. Barb, the process you described was kind of what I what I'm more familiar with and am supportive of as far as an important decision like this. So
Well,
that's all I have to say there. There are others in this committee who are probably better at crafting the actual language, but the spirit of what you described, Barb, I'm in support of.
Could I read this? Because people may be wondering what we're talking about. What I basically have written here, if this candidate cannot serve, meaning the candidate that ran actually got signatures, but didn't make it onto the Board of Trustees, it says, if this candidate cannot serve, the nominating committee shall solicit interest from eligible persons, collect and review resumes and letters of interest, and present such information to the full board. The full board should be given the opportunity to interview all the interested candidates at a special meeting of the board prior to voting on the replacement for the vacant trustee position. So that's basically what I'm asking. Can we present this to the full board, for their debate? Mike, you're the best word crafter we probably have on here. What do you think?
Can you read it one more time?
Sure. If this candidate cannot serve, the nominating committee shall solicit interest from eligible persons, collect and review resumes and letters of interest, and present such information to the full board. The full board shall be given the opportunity to interview all the interested candidates at a special meeting of the board prior to voting on the replacement for the vacant trustee position. And as I'm reading it, I'm wondering, to interview all the interested, does that put us in a conundrum if one particular individual can't make that particular meeting or doesn't show up for the meeting? Should we maybe just write to interview the interested candidates at a special board meeting? I don't know. Maybe I'm being too lawyerly here as a non-lawyer.
And what do we do if things change and we've got 20 people looking for one position? Do we interview 20 people as a board? Because that's the letter of it here. It's not being pared down by the nominating committee at all.
Right. That's what it says here.
Right.
I
So
mean, it's never happened in how many years?
Right, but again, this situation we just faced has only happened once before under very, very particular circumstances where a chunk of the board all left at the same time, all of them being in the leadership positions, and with COVID having limited access to in-person meetings and having a very short time frame to try and get bodies on the board so we could even have a quorum. So that's why I'm really against changing this bylaw right now.
This isn't really totally a response to that particular occurrence or the COVID situation. It basically codifies what our practice has been over the years. It has been open, democratic, transparent, totally. And, if we were to, in all our thinking, think about horrible scenarios, which would be a good scenario, 20 people applying. I mean, we've had an election here, one person for 4 seats has submitted their interest. So I think it's there's an expression, looking for trouble when there's no trouble to be had, so to speak. But let me get back to Mike. I interrupted you there when you were thinking.
Well, I guess this is, in response to that, maybe if this is the basic structure we want, that the nominating committee is just going to basically collect the information and act as a, channel to bring it to the full board who's going to evaluate the candidates. Is it possible to just make the bylaw less specific about exactly what has to be done, so it's open, so there's some flexibility left in exactly, how that's done? It's a little tricky because that in itself can add more delay to the whole process, right? Does it take an extra, at least if this is the bylaw that's in place, everybody knows what's going to happen. There's got to be a special meeting. So once, the candidates have been submitted, that can be set up and we can move forward. Where if we're saying, well, we're going to interview everybody or only some people, I guess there's two there let me back up a little, right? There's the big picture issue of where, what's the division of the power between the nominating committee and the board that we've been talking about. And, is it a situation like under our current bylaws, that's all the way in one direction where it says the nominating committee is supposed to choose one candidate, present that candidate to the board, and it's basically all the winnowing and selection is done by the nominating committee, and the board is only making that final approval. Then there's this amendment that's standing here, which is kind of on the other direction, which says they're just basically collecting information and acting as a channeling that to the board, and the board's going to interview everybody and see the full panel and do it. There could be an intermediate position of something which for example says that the nominating committee is going to forward all of the information for all of the candidates to the full board, along with a recommendation, but the board has the option of interviewing all of the candidates, some or all of the candidates, or I don't know, but that again, that could also add additional complication and delay, because then the board's got to decide, well, what do we just go with what's been presented to us, or do we want to interview some or all of these candidates or whatever? So I don't know. There's not a clear and easy answer that I have.
See, the thing that I'm looking at, this is a process that has worked consistently over the years. It's works well for the school board, which I'm familiar with. We've had vacancies over the last few years, and this process has always worked. The public can even see the people that come before us and their interaction with the board, and it's a total open process, and everybody participates. And to me, laying out this type of scenario is simply, as I said before, codifying what has worked in the past and has never given us a problem. I mean, with prior boards. Now, I saw somebody must have put something in the chat, but it came up so quickly I couldn't.
That was me. Someone had asked, what do other libraries do? So I went to Bethlehem and Voorheesville public libraries, because they're also school districts, and I think the most similar to ours. And I just grabbed from their bylaws what their nominating committee is supposed to do.
Okay, you want to share it publicly so that we're all aware?
Yep. So from Bethlehem, a nominating committee composed of 2 members will be appointed by the president after the school district election to designate a slate of officers to be elected at the July meeting. From Voorheesville, the president shall appoint such committees as the business of the board may require from time to time. These committees shall consist of 1 or more members and shall be considered to be discharged upon the completion of the term of the office of the president. All committees shall make a progress report to the board at each of the board's meetings. No committee shall have other than advisory powers unless the board has delegated specific power to act upon its behalf pending a subsequent meeting of the board for confirmation.
Okay.
So those don't really go to the vacancy issue.
Right.
But they do go to the other laws that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Well, that's all right. At least it gives us a little bit of a flavor of what else is out there. But getting back to
Barb,
this,
can I ask Barb a question for you? Do you happen to know if the vacancy, the practices, is that codified in a specific policy or bylaw for the school board, or is that just a practice of how the school board has done things?
it's a practice just as it was on the library board. It's just been a practice that's been used over the years, and as I said, used successfully. It wasn't codified, but if you, in our situation, if you have a situation where the leadership wants to concentrate control in the leadership versus the whole board, then you run the risk of certain things happening that the whole board doesn't really appreciate. And so this, as I said, to me was the most democratic way that you could do it. Everybody has a chance for input. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out process. As I said, none of these meetings where we've interviewed the candidates, I don't think have lasted more than an hour. And And as I said, it's total transparency. The public can see, every trustee member can see, and I like the language that I proposed. I think it puts in black and white, what we expect of our leadership in the way of allowing the board, to have full say in what is in this, particularly in the selection of one of their fellow trustees. So I guess bottom line, do we have enough votes to move this forward over to the full board for consideration or not? I obviously am in favor.
I'm not. I really think that ultimately, if we have a practice that always worked and that we had a very exceptional situation and that this whole process was discussed in the meeting prior to the 2-week window that we had to actually, solicit people and then have a nominating committee, and then the next board meeting hit so that we can actually try to have enough members to have a quorum. I think changing what's been working forever or codifying it in a different way is more than is necessary for dealing with what was a very exceptional situation.
So,
And I don't like the language of it.
Bill, so I mean, I agree with I think that maybe this proposal maybe goes too far in the direction of it being too specific about codifying exactly what has to happen in what order. But the problem is our current bylaws, as they currently exist right now, don't allow anything like what Barb has said to be the traditional practice, because it says that the nominating committee is to choose one candidate to be
Right.
presented to the board. So that kind of seems to foreclose the board taking a more active role in interviewing all the candidates or whatever, if that has been the traditional way. Again, I wasn't on the board in that period, but
I disagree with that though, because if the typical way that this gets handled, and every nominating committee is going to ask, how are we supposed to do this when there's new members on the board, like every time, and you say, this is the way we normally do it. When we're not dealing with the circumstances we were dealing with the lack of leadership and with COVID restrictions, then it would have been, yeah, you get the resumes, you do some interviews in your nominating committee, and you make some selections from there, and then you present it to the board. And then everybody from the board has the opportunity to be at that meeting. And worst case scenario, if somebody says, I really want to be involved in this process and I can't make that time, could you record the meeting so I could look at it afterwards? I don't see a problem with that either. And I don't think it has to be codified. I think it just needs to be, the nominating committee does this. Traditionally, we interview people. Everybody from the board's allowed to be there. Then we present it to the board and we have our vote. I mean, that's all possible with the rules as they are. We just had very strange circumstances happen and a very big time crunch around it.
But even right now, as I listen to you describe what you believe the practice to have always been, and when I hear Barb describe it, they sound different. And so as a newcomer, a newer comer, I don't actually know what the tradition or the practice is. And I do agree that maybe the current language, I think that's the spirit. I do think that the letter of it might be too precise and box this in. But I unfortunately don't have an alternative suggestion right now. But what I am concerned about is partially how can I say this? I think that we are increasingly seeing examples of when practice that has been in place for so long and sort of historically held to be the shared common understanding of how things go. And then when practice or the implementation deviates from that, there's nothing to fall back on to compel the practice that we all generally agree to. And so that can happen when there's a void in leadership or abrupt change. And I do think having more more explicit details gives guidance to the remaining board members in times of transition like that. Because I heard you say one thing, I've heard Barb say one thing, I heard something different in the meeting prior to the nominating committee working, and it leaves people interpreting things and not being on the same page and understanding what's actually expected and agreed upon to happen. And also in the comments prior to this review of the others, I appreciated this comment. I think this is, Natalie, are you Guilderland Library in the chat?
I'm one of them. Tim and I are in as.
Okay, so I don't
the first
know who
one I
had
think was Tim.
Okay, but Tim put in here, my main concern is that for anyone from the public who puts their hat in the ring, they deserve at least the courtesy of a phone call or an email to thank them for their interest and inform them of the process, just the courtesy of a reply or a personal contact. And so that's one, but I also think that that the rest of the board deserves to know that the candidates were talked to. And they're going to put themselves forward to have an opportunity for an exchange. I mean, they might learn that the expectations aren't what they perceived and they're not the best fit. I don't know. I'm looking for something more. I think it can be debated on if it's 20, we're boxing ourselves into an onerous thing, but right now we're boxing ourselves out of having, a broader insight into who the potential appointees are.
Just briefly to your point about the common courtesy of contacting, that 100% comes down to we had no leadership at the time, and it would have been handled by leadership, is my assumption.
Or someone who was filling someone else on the board. If, like, I didn't know what the process was, it wasn't written down anywhere. So in the absence of our leadership structure, it left new members or, newer people who weren't involved in the process in different ways in the past at a loss for how to proceed. I just think something that is adds some additional detail around sort of some basic expectations is appropriate. I agree with Mike. I think I personally would feel comfortable with something in the middle of what we currently have and what's proposed.
Okay, why don't we do this? We can let Mike, yourself, make any suggested changes. We won't present any of this, to the board for discussion yet until we sort of get more of a feel for what we want to present. So can we leave it at that, and that we'll think about it, work on it a little bit more, see if we can get maybe simpler language or whatever. But I still feel it's absolutely necessary that we codify the process to the degree that we can. Maybe using better language than's proposed here, but that there's an expectation, as I said, of transparency, of collegiality, and working together as a board to appoint a new member. We'll set
Barbara,
that aside.
have you done anything towards trying to codify that same procedure that's not codified today on the school board?
No, it's always been a practice that has always been followed.
So I still don't see why it needs to be codified
because right now we have it codified that the nominating committee has sole power of, basically
making a recommendation. Yes.
Right. So Phil, and this is kind of in Barb's defense, when this issue came up, and again, I know that it was different circumstances and we had a lot of vacancies and, there was, whatever, it wasn't typical. But when this came up at the time, Barb made the point saying, look, our practice has always been to, have a meeting where all the board members can interview all the candidates. And that's just what we've always done. And at the time she was kind of overruled and said, well, that's not what's in the bylaws. That's not the way it's going to go. And it was done just kind of strictly according to the bylaws there. So while I understand what you said, that you could make that practice consistent with what's in the bylaws by kind of inviting everyone to attend that, and having in the nominating committee, having essentially that meeting and allowing everyone to attend and doing that, it could be done, but it won't necessarily be done if that's, if other members of the board just kind of want to keep things moving fast, or the nominating committee wants to just really, move through or whatever, I don't know, just the circumstances. So, if people want to have the comfort that they're always going to have that say, I can see the point of wanting, something in the bylaws that gives them that say.
Now, the other thing, as we're talking, what we also should do is, which I did not do, is look at that section of the nominating committee and clean that up. You know, if we agree to do that. So at a future meeting, when we come back to this, you know, we should take a good look at that as well. I don't know how that slipped my mind, but it did. So, go ahead, Vanessa.
One simple question. Is there a location other than policies where we document processes and practices?
No.
It could be an option to, I don't know what it, I'm like really blanking on words of what we would call it. But we could have something that's pretty lean in the policy, but we could, for clarity purposes, have the expected procedure or the accepted procedure documented in another way.
Well, in many institutions, they have what they call a policies and procedures manual. Policies, you know, list out as we're doing here, and then the procedure of implementing that particular policy. So, you know, we don't have that at the library or at the school district. But I know
I was just asking.
I know a lot of companies do. They have a policies and procedures manual.
So, and then just to complicate things further, the other thing that occurs to me is one of the other issues that was brought up to be discussed here was about committee nomination. And so, you know, I only happened to approach, at the time Caitlin was the president, it was after my very first meeting, and asked about one of the committees or something like that. No clue of the process. And then at the next meeting, I was announced as being assigned to that. And so I think that, you know, depending what comes out of that conversation or how, I don't have any insight or understanding of how committee appointments has worked in the past. But I think when you put those two together, if there's not a clear understanding or opportunity for those who are interested to be appointed to certain committees or committees of interest, and then we allow, in this case, the nominating committee to retain such a tight control over nominating or nominating replacements for the board, it feels problematic and it probably looks problematic.
Seeing that you brought up the committees, can you folks look at Article 4 committees and some of the suggested changes? And again, that was response to past practice that wasn't implemented over like the last two leadership folks. What I try to verbalize is the past practice. Once the president is selected, the president has, in all prior years, reached out to the full board and said, let me know what committees you're interested in. And, you know, then would try to match interest with the committee and the need for it. Sometimes people had to switch because, you know, there were too many people interested in finance or too many in policy or whatever. And it's always worked out at the board level. And the other change is, and again, this is a practice that came in that, again, I just see as undemocratic. And again, I hate going back to the school board experience, but what happens there is that we collectively, you know, offer our services to X, Y, or Z committee. If there are too many people, and this will be at the organizational meeting, if there are too many people and nobody wants to withdraw from that particular committee, 4 names are thrown in the hat, 4 are pulled out, and, you know, you get on that committee and you lose and move to another committee. Again, it's a totally open, transparent process. And then at the first meeting of the committee, they are the individuals who select the chair. Because otherwise you can have your leader just choosing all friends or just choosing people that have no interest in that committee. It works very well because it's the committee choosing their chair under the guidelines that we have in our bylaws, that a person cannot chair a committee for more than 2 years. consecutively. And so if you guys would take a look, at the suggested changes, and again, if you have any reservations about the changes or suggestions, let me know.
So,
Mike?
Barb,
Yep.
overall, I like this. And I also, when I first joined the board, I was very surprised by a couple things, but I was surprised when I got appointed to committees and had never even been asked if I had, any interest in any particular committees. I was never, there was no, it was just out of the blue. I was just assigned to, a couple committees without any input. So it was kind of strange to me. But I have two comments. One is kind of just I guess just about the wording, and one is a little bit substantive, but not that much. And the two comments are in the section 5, in Article 5, in the first paragraph. It's just that.
Wait a minute, Mike. Vanessa started talking about Article 7, the committees.
Oh, okay, because I thought that went together because it's talking about. Okay, we can go to 7. I'll just focus on 7 then because
Okay,
they kind of go together. Okay,
It's really no problem.
no, that's fine.
I'm
So-
following along with this.
On Article 7, I guess my only comment here is the line where it says these committee assignments with any amendments shall be approved by the board no later than the September meeting.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of, I guess right now there's no date set or anything, it's, but I'm, I really don't think and this doesn't say it can't happen until September. It just says by September. So hopefully it could happen sooner, but I'm surprised we would want to leave it to go that long. And, we had a situation this past year, when I had first joined the board, where there was a lot of ongoing issues involving like construction, involving COVID policies and things like that. And because we had our organizing meeting in July when the brand new members joined, but we didn't assign any new committees until a month later in the August meeting, I think it was. Was that when it was? And so we had a period of time, a month or two, where there were no active committees. And I think that caused some issues and some problems at the time. Again, that was unusual situation. It won't always occur, but it seems to me it's better to get the committees up and running as soon as possible. And I know in some boards they do committee assignments at the organizational meeting at the beginning of the year, right at the start. So I mean,
Exactly.
I would be more, I would think, the election, happens in May and the new members don't start until July. I would think that you'd expect, someone to reach out even before. I mean, I know we don't have a president in place yet to the extent that, for the next term that they're involved, but, you could be soliciting, interest in committees from people before that meeting even rolls around, so that by the time you're at your organizational meeting, you can both, elect the new officers and then appoint all the committees. So everybody's up and running right from the beginning, and you'll have a month or two gap with no active committees.
Mhm. So would you want to change the language no later than the August meeting, or you want to say that it should be done at the,
I guess, and the question is, and this is just a weird thing on the time, just the timing, because you have a new incoming president, potentially coming in July, but ideally, whoever's going to be soliciting interest in these committees, that would have to happen before that meeting has even rolled around if you want the opportunity to do it at the July meeting. So I don't know how you work that exactly, but
I see your hand, Phil, but let me tell you again, the way the school district does it. At that organizational meeting, prior to that, the district clerk just sends out a list of, sort of a wish list to all the people that have been elected. Which committees, would you like to serve on? That is then available to everybody. Everybody gets a list of, people's first, second, third, and fourth choices. And after the president is elected and the vice president is elected, then the next order of business, I don't know if it's the next order of business, but it's on that, the first meeting of the year after the president has been elected. Then their discussion is held by the president and say, okay, Frederico, I see that you want to serve on policy and we have 3 other people. So that committee is set. All right. And then they go down to the next committee and oops, we have too many on communications. Does anybody want to withdraw? And, somebody inevitably usually does. I think only once in all my years of service have we had to go into pulling from the hat. And so it's done that way. So I see what you're saying, Mike, that to get it started sooner, you know, we could say that the committees will be appointed. And I don't know if you'd want to lay out the process, because this way, again, all the people on the board have had the opportunity to express their interest in whatever committees. And then the day of the organizational meeting, they're actually set. And then at the first meeting of that committee, they choose their, you know, their chair. Phil, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead. Oops, I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you.
Go ahead.
It certainly helps that they have a district clerk to manage that. But, you know, using Voorheesville as an example, they've got the same language essentially that says the president selects the committees. The problem I have with us going at the bylaws for this is that, you know, if there's a way we do things, if there's a good way to do this, if there's good leadership policy or practice to let me solicit what committees people want to be on so I can put them in places where their strengths are, where they're going to be happy, where they're willing to do the work, versus randomly assigning people and having everyone be miserable, then, I mean, the way we handle that is we elect a good leader. And that's how they do their job. And not everyone's going to do it perfectly, and not everyone's going to be happy. But I don't think we need to take everything that somebody should be doing on the board and codify it into the bylaws. I think it's okay that there are best practices and that there are people who do their job better than other people might do their job. But if we work everything you're supposed to do down to the letter into the bylaws, we're going to have the biggest set of bylaws there are, and we're going to spend most of our time managing those when we're really supposed to be here to help facilitate business at the library. And we spend a lot of time focusing on board business and not the library business.
Vanessa?
I don't disagree with that. I think that, you know, each of us have had probably slightly varying experiences. I came in when Mike did, and some of this is not understanding what the practice is. This maybe takes me back to my last comment about a way to familiarize new board members with sort of the prevailing practices. I think that what we might be falling into right now is that right now the only document that we have to reference is the policies. And it sounds like there's an interest in having other reference points, especially when there is turnover on the board or new membership. And so, like I said before, I don't think that all activities and committees are created equal. My only issue with the committee assignment part is that I had no frame of reference of what the prior practice was. I only know what I experienced, which was this magical list that fell out of the sky at one meeting that you're asked to approve on the spot. So my last comment about that was, if it is just the president picking and choosing who's on what committees and there's no option to change or be involved in an activity you might be interested in, I do think we have to, again, just re-upping, being careful of potential and perceived implications of that as it pertains to the nominating committee particularly, right? Like, so if you're just, if we want to be on a board where it's normal practice to just have the leadership pick and assign, especially to that committee, and they're going to retain the kind of primary authority to appoint new board members, we just have to know what that looks like and how it sounds. But it doesn't sound like that's been the practice. So again, I don't know who answers this question or how we solve it. I do tend to agree with Phil on this one, that I'm not looking to have the policies delineate every single practice that we conduct as board members. But I do think we're in desperate need of, I don't know, we talked once about board training. Again, just somewhere where there's a reference or some sort of, like, not historical documentation. At some point, the membership of this board won't include Barb, who has this vast knowledge, right? So, like, how do we preserve the practices and the experiences that worked and didn't? so that we can make informed choices. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the policies. So yeah, I'm rambling now, so I'll stop.
Well, no, the whole thing that by codifying these practices, you eliminate the risk of poor leadership and or a leader who basically wants total power, total control over everything. And if it's codified, you have protections built into your bylaws as to sort of retaining the responsibilities in the input of fellow trustees. So, Mike, going back to Article 5, you had some comments there, and we sort of skipped over them.
Yeah, I mean, this is not really, particularly substantive, but in the first paragraph there, there's that added line in the first sentence where it says, in conjunction with the vice president and director. Now, it seems to me that that's supposed to be referring to just preparing the agenda, which we've said, like in the next paragraph below, that the vice president and the director are going to collaborate in the agenda. But the way it's written in that paragraph, it seems like it's saying
You're right.
all, like, everything in that paragraph.
Yes.
And so, given that we already have it in the second paragraph, I feel like you could probably just delete that right there. Just say the president shall prepare an agenda for and preside at all board meetings, etc., and the rest of that paragraph. And then the next, say the vice president and the director shall collaborate with the president in developing the agendas, and then the rest of the vice president's duties. So the president still has the primary, responsibility of preparing the agenda, but you've specifically said that the vice president and the director are going to be collaborating in developing that.
Oh,
So
so
sorry to interject. I'm gonna have to hop. I did just want to leave a final thought on that. Barb, I do hear you on wanting to protect from bad leadership, but that can also stifle like creativity. I do think we want to leave some room for new ideas and practices. I'm just looking for a floor that we can all kind of agree on as sort of like a minimum sort of point of practice. But it sounds like this will be to be continued. I have a hard stop. Thank you so much for the
Vanessa,
discussion.
okay. We'll
Before you
we'll
run real
set up
quick-
another meeting.
Sure. What?
Okay,
Phil?
Vanessa.
I just want to say, I've never, in the 3 short stints I've had, I've never been involved in a board retreat, but that's absolutely necessary. And I have been involved in in-person meetings, and everything goes so much better when we can have in-person meetings, because while it's not necessarily strictly board business, the ability to be sitting with somebody else who's like, well, normally we do something like this, or hey, this is how this goes, just the quick side comments that just help make everything go and keep the machinery going, or explaining how things get done while we're all in the same room together, really facilitates that communication better. And I think the board in general has suffered from a lack of that physical togetherness during this pandemic that has really exasperated a lot of these issues. And I hope that gets cleared up soon.
I
So
completely
wanted to make
agree.
sure you heard that.
Just to second that, I'd like to say at the last month's board meeting, which was hybrid, and there were some people in person and some people over the computer. But after that meeting finished, the people who were there in person were able to just kind of stand around just for a few minutes and kind of chat and talk. And it wasn't about, substantive board business, but just kind of talking about, where people are coming from and what people are thinking and things like that. I thought was very helpful. And it's just that kind of, just to endorse everything Phil said.
We need to write a policy that we're required to have a board retreat. All right.
We get a
problem solved.
bylaw to make that
So
policy.
we'll set up another
Right, and a
doodle
bylaw to
poll.
make the policy.
right.
I gotta go. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I
wanna
need
jump
to
in
get
for-
going soon too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Just a
okay.
quick thought for you guys is that when we were meeting in person, we also used to have them, kind of the majority of the board would go out for drinks and snacks after every meeting. Some people never participated, but it was really helpful. And, life hopefully will return to normal at some point. So.
Yeah, Mike, as somebody who's new to the board, my brief multiple experiences, the first one did involve in-person meetings, going out and getting a beer afterwards, all type of stuff, and it went well,
Yeah.
despite my coming into the board because of drama and people quitting at that. Everything since then has been more challenging, and I think a lot of it just really comes down to, your experience on the board is you show up for this meet, we do what we do in the meeting, You only get as much opportunity as you can to ask questions because everybody wants to leave around 8 or 9, and then you log off and that's the end of it. Or you do the same thing for a committee meeting and you're not really actually getting to sit in a room and just chat about nothing with Barbara and feel like there's a connection with you and Barbara, and that there's that mutual respect that comes from just being able to have a conversation together and treat each other as real people, not someone on the internet that you're seeing their face. And just with, everybody going through all the stresses of COVID in general over these last few years, and then, taking on this extra volunteer workload to try and facilitate things, but feeling like there's no connectivity in that, I think has just really exasperated all of these issues. And that's one of the main reasons that I very heavily lean towards not focusing on codifying what would be normal procedures that make sense in a normal situation into our bylaws, when these bylaws have served, for the most part, for these 20 plus years that they've been in place, 40, 60, I don't know, forever. And that similar bylaws work well at other libraries, at the school district, everywhere else. I think we're just missing that connection of, the president does sit around a room with everybody and we talk about, oh, so what committees are you interested in, and blah, blah, blah. Instead, now it's somebody has to get around to emailing a bunch of people and gathering things. So a lot of these little things that would be common practices just get lost because we're all in this turn on the meeting, turn off the meeting, goodbye mode. So.
Totally unrelated, Phil, thank you for the comments, but I had a question. Long range planning as being a standing committee. I just had a question on that, how you folks felt. That seems to be not something that you're serving every single year. After you develop your plan, then, a year or two goes by where there is no activity. To me, that's more like an ad hoc committee, but I wanted to get your feelings on that, if you have the time.
Was long range planning one of the things that's part of the state laws that we have to have a standing committee on?
Well, no, it's just that we have to have a plan. That's the only
Okay.
law.
Right.
My thought on it is that it's a shame that Andy is not interested in running for a position, because I thought he had some great ideas with respect to that the idea of a long range plan is too rigid and doesn't really make a lot of sense in today's world. And the idea of instead having a strategic plan that you're working toward, that's more realistic and that you can modify year to year to make more sense as necessary. I think that's the kind of thing that long range planning committee should really be involved in, is making sure that what we're doing matches what our strategic plan is. And if we have to put out a document that represents a long range plan related to that for the state's purposes, so be it. But a committee that basically looks at what are we doing and does it serve what we've decided is our strategic goals, I think makes sense. But also I think it makes sense to consolidate that into another committee so that they meet more than once a year.
Well, that's my concern. Can't that just simply be a task force that, as that need arises, because anybody that's been assigned to that committee over the last 5 years really hasn't had a meeting to go to. And so, again, like finance, personnel, those are committees and policy that are active and you have to have, because it's day-to-day operations. What's your feeling, Mike?
I hear what you're saying. I honestly haven't really thought about that very much. I don't have well-formed idea on that. I get what you're saying about, if it's something that only becomes relevant every 5 years, then having a standing committee doesn't seem to make sense. But I hear what Phil's saying also about, maybe we should be kind of, shifting in a different direction in how we look at our long-term planning. But I haven't thought really deeply about it.
Tim, you wanted to add to it?
Yeah, I like your idea there, Barbara, that it would become an ad hoc committee when needed to write the occasional document every 3, 4, or 5 years. One of the reasons I like it is because I've been here 8 years and I've still never seen a single meeting of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. So I think the fact that the two are slapped together, people, not just us, but previous board members, tend to think of that committee as just the long range planning committee. And in fact, the vast majority of my issues and time in the last 8 years have been building and grounds related. And I've got essentially, and I'm not complaining, just observing, essentially zero input from the board on the building and the grounds. And sorry, I hope this doesn't strike anyone the wrong way, but I was talking to our architect, Natalie, before, or excuse me, Megan before, who has been doing library design projects for 15 years. And she said, hands down, this is the least amount of board involvement I've ever seen, and it's not even close. So I don't say that to hurt anyone's feelings, but just to reflect on the idea that managing the building itself is really hard, and it's something that librarians aren't trained to do, and we would welcome some input from the board. So I like making LRP ad hoc because perhaps the Buildings and Grounds Committee would actually meet. Now I have to say, in fairness, I've never asked them to meet either, but you guys have just let us handle the building except where big financial decisions are involved. And that's perhaps appropriate, but if there's expertise, we'll take it, you know, so.
Right.
Right.
Okay,
Well,
well,
I have to get going.
yep, I
So-
was going to say, we haven't solved anything yet, but we'll set up another doodle poll.
Talk.
And in the meantime, as I said, Mike, if you want to clean up the language.
I'll see what I can do,
Article
yeah.
5, and I guess Phil wants to strike all this stuff, but we'll have further discussions, and I'll also pull out the nominating committee, because that really is sort of the source of the discussions that we're handling right now. So we'll take another look. So I'll have her send out a doodle poll. Jenna will do that, and we can meet again for another short meeting. Okay?
Thanks.
Got it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.